I rescued alien children, but they were the children of a widowed alien queen, and now the queen wants me. The distress signal had been bouncing off Liam's receiver for 11 minutes before he finally pulled himself out from under the belly of a half-dead terrain crawler and actually listened to it. It was faint, the kind of signal that didn't so much announce an emergency as quietly suggest that one might be occurring, if it wasn't too much trouble to check. He wiped the black grease from his hands onto a rag that was somehow greasier than his hands, and stood in the doorway of his outpost, squinting at the copper-colored sky. Vora was not a planet that attracted attention. It sat in the outer belt of the Sarin system like something the universe had set down and forgotten about. All red dunes and iron-heavy air, and silence so complete it had texture. Liam had been here for 3 years, maintaining a fuel and salvage post for passing freight ships, and in that time the most dramatic thing that had happened was a sandstorm that buried his secondary generator for a week. He had named the generator Gerald. Gerald had not survived. The signal pulsed again. He crossed to his console, brushing sand off the screen with the side of his wrist, and pulled up the atmospheric scanner. Something was coming down fast, too fast. About 4 kilometers northwest, near the basin, the locals on the nearest settlement called the Red Mouth, because of how the dunes curved inward there, like the earth was trying to swallow itself. Whatever was falling wasn't a freight hauler. Too small. The descent pattern was all wrong. Spiraling, stuttering, the kind of trajectory that meant whoever was flying had either lost control or had never been particularly good at flying to begin with. Liam grabbed his jacket, his field kit, and his portable Atmos scanner, and was halfway to his crawler before he went back inside for water. He had learned in 3 years on Vora that forgetting water was the category of mistake a person was only allowed to make once. He heard the impact before he saw it. A low, resonant boom that rolled across the dunes like a struck bell, followed by a plume of dark smoke rising into the rust-colored afternoon. He pushed the crawler harder than its aging engine appreciated, and it complained the entire way in a high mechanical whine that he had also been meaning to fix for approximately 8 months. The ship was small, a courier-class vessel, he thought, or something built along similar lines, and it had come to rest at a 40-degree angle against the far wall of the basin, its nose buried in the sand, and its rear section buckled and scorched. One of the stabilizer wings had sheared off completely and was lying 20 meters away like a discarded playing card. Smoke was still threading upward from the drive housing, and Liam's Atmos scanner immediately began noting elevated ion readings, which was a polite scientific way of saying the ship's core was unhappy and becoming more so. He moved quickly. The entry hatch had been warped by the impact but hadn't sealed, and he forced it the rest of the way with his shoulder and a word he reserved for significant occasions. Inside, the cabin was small and dim, emergency lighting casting everything in pale amber. 2 safety harnesses had deployed from the rear seats. In them were 2 children. He stopped. They were small, perhaps 4 and 6 years old, if he was translating that correctly across species, which he was aware he might not be. Their skin held a faint iridescent quality in the amber light, and their ears swept back in long, elegant curves from the sides of their faces, tapering to soft points. They were staring at him with enormous dark eyes and the particular expression of children who are deciding, with great seriousness, whether or not to trust someone. The younger one had something green and sticky on her face. He had no idea what it was. He chose not to investigate. "Okay," Liam said in the gentle, careful tone of a man who had no experience with children and was aware of this fact. "I'm going to get you out of here. The ship is—" He glanced back at the smoking drive housing. "Having a bad day, and I'd rather we not be here when it finishes having it." The older child said something in a language his translator chip rendered as approximately 60% static and 40% what might have been the word for either safety or snack. He hoped safety. He unclipped the harnesses with hands that were steadier than he felt and lifted the younger child first. She weighed almost nothing and immediately grabbed a fistful of his jacket with a grip that suggested she had no intention of letting go, and then held out his hand to the older one, who studied it for 3 full seconds before accepting it with great dignity. They were 30 meters from the ship when the drive core finally made its decision. The explosion was not enormous, more of a definitive conclusion than a catastrophe, but it was enough to push all three of them forward into the sand in a graceless heap. Liam rolled to cover the children instinctively, and when the heat passed, he lifted his head to find the younger child already sitting up, studying the burning wreckage with an expression of pure scientific fascination. The older one looked at him, then at the fire, then back at him. "Yeah," Liam said, brushing sand from his face. "That happens sometimes." Getting two alien children back to the outpost was an experience Liam would later describe, to no one in particular, as character building. The older child, who eventually communicated through a combination of gestures and the 30 or so words his translator Chip managed to pull from their language, that his name was Ren, walked with careful composure, as though the desert were a formal occasion he had chosen to attend. The younger one, Sila, did not walk so much as investigate. Every rock, every drift of sand, every beetle that made the mistake of crossing her path. Liam spent most of the journey gently redirecting her away from things she was about to either eat or dismantle. His translator Chip was doing its best. He respected that, but its best in this case was producing results that ranged from the mildly confusing to the philosophically troubling. At one point, Ren said something that the Chip rendered as, "Either I am grateful or the horizon is made of old promises." Liam told him he was welcome either way. Back at the outpost, he settled them onto the worn bench near the console and tried to think practically. They were physically unharmed. He had checked as carefully as he could without a proper medical scanner, and neither of them appeared to be in shock, which was more composure than he would have managed at their age after a spacecraft explosion. He filed an emergency report through the outpost's long-range comm, flagging the crash coordinates and requesting guidance from the nearest transit authority, which was based out of a station roughly 6 hours away at standard relay speed. Then he stared at the children. They stared back. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Ren translated for Sila. Sila's response was immediate and emphatic. He opened his storage unit and surveyed its contents with the quiet despair of a man who had never needed to impress anyone with his pantry. He had protein blocks, which tasted like determination. He had dehydrated grain meal, which tasted like a lesser form of determination. He had 1 tin of something a passing trader had sold him as a delicacy from the outer reach worlds, which he had opened once, reconsidered, and sealed again. And he had a bag of dried fruit from the last supply run, slightly past its best date, but structurally sound. He put the fruit in front of them. Scylla consumed it with the focused energy of a small machine designed for that specific purpose. Ren ate more slowly, watching Liam move around the outpost with the same careful attention he had given the desert, as though he was cataloging everything for a report he intended to file later. "Your ship's registration was encrypted," Liam said, mostly to himself, watching the transit authority's acknowledgement pulse slowly on his console. "That's either government or private security. Either way, someone is going to come looking for you." Ren said something the chip translated as, "We are known, or possibly we are a significant weather event." The confidence in his expression suggested the first. Liam nodded slowly. "Great. That's either very reassuring or very complicated. Maybe both." He gave them water. He showed Ren how the console's basic display worked, which turned out to be a mistake in the direction of Ren becoming immediately and completely absorbed in it, scrolling through atmospheric readouts with an intensity that made Liam feel slightly judged about the backlog of unfiled maintenance reports currently sitting in the system. Sila, meanwhile, had found his jar of spare calibration bolts and was arranging them on the floor in patterns that seemed to follow some internal logic he couldn't identify. Night on Vora arrived the way it always did, quickly and without ceremony, the sky shifting from burnt copper to a deep arterial red before collapsing into black. The twin moons rose early, washing the dunes outside in pale silver light. Liam turned on the outpost's interior heating, which worked well enough except in the far corner by the water recycler, where it had never worked, and he had simply accepted that corner as belonging to the cold now. He pulled out 2 of his thermal field blankets and laid them on the bench, and when Sela climbed onto one and pulled it around herself like a cocoon and was asleep within minutes, something in his chest performed a small unexpected motion that he didn't have an immediate classification for. Ren did not sleep. He sat at the edge of his blanket and looked at the door, and then at Liam, and said something soft and specific that the translator chip, for once, rendered with unusual clarity. She will come for us. Your mother? Liam asked. Ren seemed to consider how to answer that. Then he sat a little straighter, the instinctive, practiced posture of someone who had grown up watching a person carry great weight with great grace, and said the word again, differently. Not as reassurance, as information. She will come for us. Liam looked at the door, then at the long-range scanner, which was currently showing nothing unusual on approach, then back at the boy, who had the eyes of someone who understood things at a depth his age shouldn't have allowed yet. Okay, Liam said, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. I'll put the kettle on. He had expected a ship. What arrived felt more like a statement. The long-range scanner picked it up 3 hours before dawn, a vessel of considerable size moving through Vora's outer atmosphere, with a kind of unhurried certainty that suggested it had never once considered the possibility of being told no. It wasn't broadcasting a standard approach signal. It didn't request landing clearance. It simply came down, the way a fact comes down. And the red dunes outside Liam's outpost window filled with light as though a second sun had decided to try a different location. He stood at the window with his cup of synthetic coffee and watched it descend. Ren stood beside him, having not slept at all, and there was something in the boy's stillness that reminded Liam of the moment before a significant equation resolves. That particular quality of waiting that isn't anxious because the answer's already known. The ship settled onto the flat ground beyond the dunes with a sound like a long breath released, and then it was quiet again, and the light shifted from landing burned gold to a steady, cool illumination that pooled across the sand in clean lines. It was a beautiful ship. Liam, who thought about ships mostly in terms of what was wrong with them and how long it would take to fix, found himself noting that it was a beautiful ship. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. The first to emerge were the guards, 6 of them, moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who had trained very hard to make other people feel immediately and thoroughly outclassed. They wore deep-colored armor that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, and they took up positions along the path from the ship to the outpost door with a geometric precision that made Liam's own parking habits feel like a personal failing. Then she stepped out. He had been forming expectations, in the loose and cautious way a person does when they know something significant is approaching. He had not formed the right ones. She crossed the sand toward his door with a composure so complete it didn't register as effort. It registered as atmosphere, as condition, as the simple nature of the space she occupied. Her skin held that same faint iridescent quality as the children's, but richer, deeper, like light seen through still water, and her long ears framed a face that was carrying something heavy with extraordinary discipline. She was tall. She moved as though gravity was a courtesy she was choosing to accept. Liam set down his coffee cup and opened the door before she knocked, because it seemed absurd to make her knock, and then immediately questioned whether opening it preemptively was worse somehow. And then she was standing in his doorway, and the question dissolved. For a moment she didn't speak. Her eyes moved past him to Ren, who had straightened into that careful posture again, and then to Scylla, who had woken at the sound of the ship and was now standing in the middle of the room with her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, looking tremendously unbothered. Something crossed the Queen's face, fast and unguarded, there and gone, that Liam recognized even across the considerable distance of species and circumstance, because it was the look of someone who has been frightened and is only now in this moment allowing themselves to stop. She crossed the room to them. She spoke to them quietly in their language, her voice low and even, and Scylla walked into her arms without ceremony and Ren followed, and the Queen held them both with her eyes closed for a few seconds that Liam felt he should probably not be watching, and watched anyway. Then she straightened and turned to him, and the composure was back, fully assembled, not a piece missing. "You are the one who brought them out," she said. Her translator technology was considerably better than his. Her words arrived clean and precise, with only the faintest architectural difference in rhythm that reminded him the language had been built somewhere else entirely. "Yes," Liam said. "I'm Liam. I run this outpost." He paused. "It's not usually this clean. I had some advance notice." One of the guards near the door made no expression whatsoever, which Liam was fairly certain was a trained response to a comment that had almost been funny. "I am Arya," she said, and the simplicity of it, no title, just the name, offered the way one offers something of actual value, landed differently than he anticipated. "My children tell me you fed them and gave them shelter and showed Ren your atmospheric data systems." He seemed interested. "He has already identified 2 inefficiencies in your filing structure." Liam looked at Ren. Ren looked back with the serene expression of someone who considered this helpful. "I'll take that as a thank you," Liam said. Something moved briefly at the corner of Arya's mouth. It did not become a smile. It thought about it seriously, considered the implications, and decided against it for now. But the thought had clearly occurred. "Your ship's core vented completely on impact," Liam said, moving toward the console, stepping back into the practical because it was ground, he understood. "I documented the crash site and filed with the Transit Authority 6 hours ago. The wreckage will need a formal recovery team. There may be navigational data worth pulling from the secondary drive if it survived the heat." She watched him speak with an attention that was precise and total, the kind of listening that didn't simply receive words, but examined them from several angles simultaneously. It was, he thought, slightly unnerving. He kept talking because stopping felt worse. "I can send you everything I recorded if you give me a secure relay address." The ion readings before the explosion suggested a cascade failure in the stabilization grid, which probably started. "Liam," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for my children." The outpost was very quiet. Outside, the twin moons were setting, and the first gray suggestion of Vora's dawn was beginning at the edge of the dunes. Scylla had fallen back asleep against her mother's side. Ren was watching Liam with those old, careful eyes. Liam nodded once. "The coffee's terrible," he said, "but there's more of it if you want." She accepted the coffee. That was the part Liam kept returning to, in the small, distracted way his mind had of flagging things it considered significant before the rest of him had caught up. He had offered it as a kind of deflection, something to do with his hands, something to fill the particular quality of silence that had settled in the outpost after her thanks. And she had accepted it with the same composure she brought to everything, wrapping both hands around the cup the way someone does when they have been cold for a long time and are only now admitting it. She did not immediately drink it. She looked at it first. He appreciated that, because it suggested she had good instincts. "I should warn you," he said, settling into the chair across from her, while Sayla slept against her side, and Ren had migrated back to the console with the focused determination of someone with unfinished business, that it's made from a synthetic compound I buy from a freight trader who describes it as coffee adjacent. I've been drinking it long enough that I've lost the ability to evaluate it objectively. Arya looked at him over the rim of the cup. Then she drank. The pause that followed was diplomatic. He respected it. "It is," she said carefully, "very strong. That's the kindest thing anyone has said about it." This time the corner of her mouth moved with more conviction, though it still stopped short of a full declaration. He was beginning to think of it as a threshold she was considering crossing, like someone standing at the edge of something they hadn't stood at the edge of in a long time. The dawn was arriving in stages outside the outpost window, the sky shifting through colors that Vora did well. Deep amber bleeding into pale gold. The dunes catching the early light and throwing long shadows that made the desert look briefly, accidentally beautiful. Arya's gaze moved to the window and stayed there for a moment, and her expression shifted into something quieter, something less arranged. "Your planet is desolate," she said, not unkindly, more as an observation about a condition than a judgment about a choice. "It has a certain minimalist appeal," Liam said. "Once you accept that it's trying to kill you, the relationship becomes much more honest." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise, recalibrated quickly into assessment. "You've been here 3 years. The Transit Authority data. You read the report I filed." "I read everything relevant to my children's safety before I entered an unknown outpost on an unmapped desert planet," she said in the tone of someone stating a fact so obvious they find it mildly interesting that it requires stating. "You came here from the Kepler stations. You hold a Class 4 engineering certification. You have filed 47 maintenance reports in 3 years, of which 11 are marked incomplete. She glanced toward the console. Ren found 13. Liam turned to look at Ren, who did not look up from the screen. He's thorough, Liam said. He is his father's son, Arya said, and the sentence arrived differently from the ones before it. The same words, the same measured delivery, but with something moving beneath them, the way deep water moves differently from shallow water, even when the surface looks the same. Liam didn't fill the silence that followed. He had learned in 3 years of solitary outpost work and a lifetime before that of being better with machines than people, that some silences were not asking to be filled. They were asking to be allowed. Arya looked down at her cup. He would have cataloged everything, she said, every inefficiency. He believed very strongly that systems should work as well as they possibly could. A pause. He also believed that people who built imperfect systems were simply people who hadn't been given sufficient time. She said this last part as though it was something she had held in storage for a while, and was only now, in this strange outpost on this unimportant planet, finding somewhere to put it. He sounds like he was good at his job, Liam said. He was good at most things, she said. He was less good at existing within the limits of what a body's allowed to withstand. She said it without bitterness, the way someone speaks about a truth they have finished being angry at and are now simply carrying. The illness took 18 months. He spent 16 of them making sure everything would continue to function without him. She looked at Ren's back, at the small figure bent seriously over the console. He succeeded mostly. Liam followed her gaze. Sela shifted in her sleep and made a small sound, and Arya's hand moved automatically to her back. The gesture so practiced and instinctive, it seemed to come from somewhere below thought entirely. Mostly, Liam said quietly. There are gaps, she said, that administration cannot fill. Outside, the sun was fully up now, and the desert was doing what it did in the early hours. The temperature climbing in that rapid, committed way that made mornings on Vora feel like a renegotiation of terms. One of the guards outside shifted position, and the shadow he cast moved across the outpost window in a slow line. Liam got up and refilled her cup without asking. She didn't object. The salvage map's on your wall, she said, nodding toward the sprawl of charts and hand-annotated overlays pinned above his workbench. You've been charting the basin system. Old habit, the dunes shift after storms, and sometimes they turn up wreckage from older transit routes. Nothing valuable, usually. Components, mostly. Occasionally something interesting. And today, she said, looking at him with that precise, total attention again. Liam considered the question and the weight behind it, and the way she was sitting in his outpost in the early morning light, drinking his terrible coffee, as though she had not yet found a reason to stop. Today, he said, was more interesting than most. The ship was ready by mid-morning. Liam knew this because one of the guards, the one stationed nearest the door, who had the particular stillness of someone who had graduated at the top of every program they had ever attended, came to the outpost threshold and communicated it with a single look in Arya's direction. It was the kind of look that contained an entire sentence, possibly a paragraph. Arya received it, acknowledged it with the smallest inclination of her head, and did not move. The guard returned to his position outside. Liam busied himself at the workbench, recalibrating a sensor array that did not strictly need recalibrating because it gave him something to do with his hands and a reasonable excuse to have his back partially turned while he tried to identify what exactly was happening in his outpost. He was a man who understood systems, mechanical systems, atmospheric systems, the navigational logic of salvage routes across shifting desert terrain. What was currently occurring felt like a system he did not have the manual for. Ren had abandoned the console, reluctantly, and only after Liam had quietly suggested that 13 filed inefficiency reports was probably a complete set, and was now sitting beside his mother, engaged in what appeared to be a low, serious conversation that his translator chip rendered at about 40% accuracy, which meant Liam was receiving every other word and constructing a very approximate picture. He caught the words return and prepared, and one word that might have been either palace or structure, or possibly the concept of organized obligation. He stopped trying to follow it and focused on his sensor array. Sela was beneath the workbench. He had no clear accounting of when she had moved there. She had simply at some point decided that the space under his workbench was where she needed to be, and was now sitting cross-legged in it, examining one of his old transit band receivers with the calm focus of a specialist brought in to assess a situation. He had checked that it contained nothing she could hurt herself with, and then decided to let the situation develop naturally. "She does this," Arya said from across the room, and Liam turned to find that Arya had been watching him discover Scylla under the workbench, with an expression that was the closest thing to openly amused he had seen from her yet. "In new places, she finds the smallest available space and occupies it until she has decided the larger space is acceptable." "That's either very wise or very relatable," Liam said. Her father called it tactical assessment. Something warm moved through the words. "I called it stubbornness. We were both correct." Sela emerged from under the workbench at that moment, holding the transit band receiver, and presented it to Liam with the solemn air of someone returning a borrowed item they had thoroughly evaluated. He accepted it with equal solemnity. She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to sit beside her brother. The outpost felt different with them in it. He hadn't registered it happening. The shift had been gradual, the way temperature changes gradually, noticeable only in retrospect. But the space that had been defined for 3 years entirely by his own presence, his own rhythms, his own particular brand of organized disorder, had rearranged itself around these 3 people with quiet ease. He was not sure how he felt about how natural it seemed. Arya rose and moved to the salvage maps on the wall, studying them with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Her fingers traced one of the basin routes without touching the paper, hovering just above it, following the line he had drawn after last year's storm season. "You mapped this section alone?" she asked. "Survey drones for the initial pass, then on foot for anything the drones flagged. The basin floor is unstable in places. Too much sensor interference from the iron deposits for remote work to be reliable." "On foot," she repeated, not as a question but as though she was placing the information somewhere specific. "Alone, on a planet that is, by your own description, attempting to kill you. It's more of an ongoing negotiation at this point." She turned from the map and looked at him directly, and there was something in the look that was different from the precise assessments of the morning. Less analytical, more considered, as though she was not measuring data but making a decision about it. "You are not what I expected to find here," she said. "I'm not sure what the expected version would have been." "Someone temporary," she said. "Someone passing through." She glanced at the maps, at the 3 years of careful accumulated notation covering every wall of the room. "You are not passing through." "No," Liam agreed. "I just ended up staying." He paused. "Vora has a way of making leaving feel like more effort than it's worth. Also, Gerald destroyed my motivation for approximately 4 months." She looked at him with patient, genuine confusion. "Gerald?" "My secondary generator. He died in a sandstorm. It was a difficult period." The full smile arrived then. Sudden and unannounced, the way things arrive that have been held back long enough that when they finally come, they come completely. It transformed her face not into something different, but into something more entirely itself, and Liam felt the specific cognitive disruption of a man who has been watching a door and was not quite prepared for what came through it. She recovered her composure quickly. He suspected she had significant practice. "I have something for you," she said, and reached into the inner panel of her jacket, a deliberate, prepared gesture, the kind that had been decided upon before she walked into the outpost that morning. She produced a small card, narrow and luminous, the material shifting faintly between colors in a way that suggested it was something other than simple print. She held it out to him. He took it. The surface was warm and the light it carried moved slowly, like something alive and patient. "An invitation," she said, "to the palace at Sariva, formally as a recognition of what you did for my children. There would be a ceremony, acknowledgement before the court." She said this part evenly, establishing the official architecture of it. Then, with a precision that suggested she was choosing the words very carefully, she added, "The invitation is open. There is no fixed date. It is yours to use when you choose." Liam looked at the card. The light in it moved through a slow, deep green that reminded him of something he couldn't immediately name. A ceremony, he said. Among other things, Arya said, and then turned to collect Sila's blanket from the bench with the composure of someone who has said exactly what they intended to say and does not intend to elaborate further. Outside, the guards were moving in the coordinated way that meant departure was becoming concrete. Ren came to stand beside Liam and looked up at him with those careful ancient eyes and said something the translator rendered with its usual creative liberty as either "come and find us" or "the stars remember the people who look at them." Liam decided, looking at the card in his hand, that both translations worked well enough. The ship rose without ceremony. That was how Liam would remember it afterward. Not the sound, not the light, but the absence that followed. The way the air settled back into itself once the engines had cleared the atmosphere, as though the desert was simply resuming a conversation that had been briefly interrupted. He stood outside the outpost for a long time after the ship had gone, until there was nothing left to watch except the ordinary sky. And then he went inside and stood in the middle of his outpost and looked at what 3 people had left behind in the space of a single day. A folded thermal blanket on the bench, a collection of calibration bolts arranged on the floor in Scylla's precise personal geometry. 13 inefficiency reports filed neatly into his console's maintenance queue, each one thorough and correct and mildly humbling. And on the workbench, next to the transit band receiver that had been inspected and returned with professional courtesy, the luminous card, its slow internal light moving through greens and deep blues like something that had decided to be patient about being answered. He made coffee. This was not a decision so much as a physical inevitability, the thing his hands did while the rest of him was occupied elsewhere. He drank it standing at the window, watching the dunes return to their usual indifferent arrangement in the afternoon heat, and he thought about what Arya had said about gaps that administration cannot fill. He thought about that for quite a while. The transit authority sent a recovery team for the wreckage 2 days later, a standard 4-person unit in a scanning vessel that landed at the basin with the brisk efficiency of people who had a list and intended to work through it. Their team lead, a compact and businesslike woman named Dara, reviewed his crash documentation with raised eyebrows and asked him twice if he had been alone when he filed it. "Completely," Liam said, "and the children were uninjured." "Completely." She looked at him with the expression of someone revising a prior assessment. "The ship's registration trace came back this morning," she said, pulling up her scanner. "You know whose vessel that was?" "I have some idea." Dara looked at him for a long moment. Then she closed her scanner, handed him a copy of the recovery filing, and said with great professional neutrality, "Well, you have a good day then," and returned to her team with the energy of someone who had decided not to ask any further questions on the grounds that the answers would complicate her afternoon. He went back to work. This was, he told himself, straightforward. There were 3 incomplete maintenance reports that Ren had not managed to get to. He'd only had one night after all, which Liam thought showed reasonable restraint. And the terrain crawler's engine complaint had evolved from a whine into something that sounded more like an opinion. And Gerald's replacement generator, which he had not named because he'd learned his lesson, was showing an early inefficiency in its thermal cycling that wanted attention before it became a problem. He worked through the days with the same rhythm he had maintained for 3 years. He filed his reports. He ran his salvage routes. He ate his protein blocks and his determination-flavored grain meal and his coffee-adjacent compound. And in the evenings, he sat at the window and watched the twin moons rise over the dunes, and he thought with increasing frequency and decreasing resistance about a palace among the stars. On the 9th day, he took the luminous card from the workbench and held it in the full light of Vora's afternoon sun. The colors in it moved slowly, unhurried, green deepening into blue, deepening into something at the edge of visible spectrum that he didn't have a name for. It was warm in his hand, the same warmth it had carried when she gave it to him. He turned it over. On the reverse, in a script his translator chip rendered with uncharacteristic confidence, as though even the technology felt this was important enough to get right, were coordinates. A star system he didn't know, a planet designation, and a single word beneath them that translated cleanly and without ambiguity. The word was whenever. He set the card down. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the salvage maps on the wall. 3 years of careful, accumulated work. Every basin route and dune shift in iron deposit. Every storm season recorded in his own handwriting. The outpost's entire known world laid out in annotated lines across paper that was starting to yellow at the edges. He looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something when you are not really looking at it, but are instead having a conversation with yourself that you have been postponing. Then he went to find his bag. It was under the workbench, where Scylla had sat in the smallest available space, conducting her tactical assessment. And it was already half-packed from some previous and apparently optimistic version of himself that had gotten there first. He looked at it for a moment. He added socks, his field kit, the portable Atmos scanner. He looked at the terrible coffee compound on the shelf, considered it, and packed it. If Arya had managed to drink 2 cups of it while conducting what he was now fairly certain had been a significant and deliberate conversation, the least he could do was bring the source material. He filed a temporary closure notice with the transit authority, not permanent, he noted twice in the filing, and he wrote a short maintenance brief for any freight crew that might need the outpost in his absence, which covered the generator's thermal cycling issue and the crawler's opinion-forming engine and the cold corner by the water recycler, which he described simply as a known condition. He stood in the doorway with his bag and looked back at the outpost. The calibration bolts were still on the floor in Scylla's pattern. He had not moved them, and realized now that he had not moved them deliberately, and that this probably told him something he had already known. He locked the door. He walked to the flat ground where Arya's ship had rested, where the sand still held the faint impression of landing struts in a geometry too precise to be accidental. He opened a comm channel on his wrist unit and input the coordinates from the card with the careful attention of a man who has decided to be accurate about where he is going. And he sent a single short transmission on the open relay frequency. It said, "I found an inefficiency in my own filing system, coming to address it." He sat on his bag in the red sand and waited, and the desert was very quiet around him, and the twin moons were already visible on the pale horizon even before the sun had finished setting, which Vora did sometimes. Let 2 things occupy the sky at once, as though it saw no reason why that should be a problem. 40 minutes later, his comm unit returned a single line of text, no sender identification, in the clean, precise rhythm of someone who chose words the way they chose everything, with intention and without waste. It said, "We will be there by morning." Liam read it twice. Then he looked up at the sky, at the specific stretch of deep and permanent dark where the stars were beginning to appear one by one in the cooling air. And somewhere in that dark was a palace, and in it was a queen who had drunk his terrible coffee and smiled at a dead generator's name, and said the word whenever, like it was a door she was leaving open on purpose. He lay back on the sand and watched the stars arrive, and for the first time in 3 years, the sky above Vora did not look like a ceiling. It looked like a direction. The end. So here we are, at the edge of the red dunes, watching a man lie on his back in the sand, and finally, look at the sky like it means something. Liam spent 3 years on a planet that was trying to kill him, filing incomplete maintenance reports and drinking coffee that deserved a formal apology, telling himself that staying was simply easier than leaving. And then 2 small children fell out of the sky, and a queen drank his terrible coffee and almost smiled. And suddenly, the calculus of staying and leaving rearranged itself entirely. So let me ask you something. If you were Liam, alone on your own version of Vora, comfortable in your solitude, your routines, your cold corner by the water recycler, and something arrived unexpectedly that made the sky look like a direction instead of a ceiling, would you pack your bag? Or would you find a reason to stay on the ground? And what about Arya? She carried her loss with the discipline of someone who had decided that grief was a private room, not a place to receive visitors. It took a desert mechanic with terrible coffee and no talent for diplomacy to leave that door open again. If you were her, would you have handed over that card? Would you have said whenever and meant it? These are the questions that good stories leave behind. Not answers, but the right kind of unfinished business. If this story stayed with you, if Liam's quiet bravery or Arya's careful longing or Sila's tactical assessment of the space under a workbench made you feel something worth feeling, then let us know in the comments below. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me which character you saw yourself in. Tell me if you would have drunk the coffee. And if you enjoyed the journey, please like this story and subscribe so you never miss the next departure. Every story I tell begins somewhere unexpected and ends somewhere that, hopefully, feels like it was always where we were heading. Because the next story is already waiting. New characters, new worlds, new questions worth sitting